to the annual earnings of full-time workers.
Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And we're all thinking of the lovely Glenys Kinnock and her family, especially the Honourable Member for Aberavon at this time. But the number of emergency food parcels distributed by the Trussell...
Order. Does it occur to honourable members that when they're speaking at normal speaking tone rather than whispering, while a member is asking a question, that it's really rude and discourteous? Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The number of emergency food parcels distributed by Trussell Trust Food Banks in Newport West is on the rise. In 2018, the number of parcels distributed was 1,971. In the same period this year, over 3,000 were distributed to families. There was nothing in the autumn statement that would make this situation better. Why not?
Well, yes, Madam Deputy Speaker, I must, with respect, disagree with the Honourable Lady. The fact that inflation has been halved is obviously going to be a benefit to anyone receiving food parcels. The fact that there's been a cut in national insurance is going to be beneficial to people. The fact that there's been an increase in the living wage is going to be beneficial to people. The fact that pensions and benefits are going up in line with inflation is going to be beneficial to people in her constituency. What is not going to be beneficial to her constituents is the Welsh Labour government wanting to spend over £100 million creating extra Senate members, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Oliver Hield.
The Minister will be aware that the UK-EU Parliamentary Partnership Assembly has been meeting in Westminster this week. And one of the things which was particularly made clear by the co-chair, Nathalie Loiseau, MEP, was that Glenys Kinnock had made a huge contribution in the European Parliament, particularly in advocating women's rights, and that it was something that she particularly wanted to record. So it's not just in this Parliament that she'll be remembered for her role in politics. But does he agree with me that cutting national insurance contributions, the improvement to the national living wage and the cutting of inflation are crucial to Welsh households as they are across the UK?
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I agree with my right honourable friend on all of those points? First of all, that Glenys Kinnock has made an enormous contribution to politics in this country, as has her husband, whom we send our condolences, as is her son, who at this very moment is also working very hard to support steelmaking in South Wales, and it's a pleasure to work with him on the transition board in Port Talbot, even though we have some disagreements from time to time on political matters. So may I add to the tributes and support everything he said, and of course agree with him that the recent changes made in the autumn statement are going to be beneficial to people in Wales.
Selene Saxby.
Question 7, please, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I have regular, in fact frequent conversations with Cabinet colleagues and stakeholders to support the floating offshore wind industry, which will create high-quality jobs in Wales. The Government fully supports plans for up to 4 gigawatts of floating offshore wind in the Celtic Sea and is working to bring forward an additional 12 gigawatts through the 2030s, with the potential to bring forward up to £20 billion worth of investment.
Selene Saxby.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Previous offshore wind developments on England's east coast have shown that appropriate planning is needed to minimise disruption to communities. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the development of floating offshore wind in the Celtic Sea should see single cable corridors, one to his side of the water and just one to the north coast of Devon or Cornwall, to reduce environmental and societal disruption?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I know that the electricity systems operator are currently reviewing the design of connections for offshore wind projects. I met last week, possibly earlier this week, with the Crown Estates, and also have been meeting with National Grid to discuss some of the issues around cabling and the reconfiguration of the grid. But the actual decision as to where the cables would go and how many of them there are going to be is a fairly technical one, which I fear I'm not really qualified to take a view on myself. But I can assure the Honourable Lady that I know Crown Estates and National Grid would be more than happy to talk to her about that particular issue.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for his response to that question? Minister, any onshore and offshore wind in the Celtic Sea will affect, of course, those fishermen in Northern Ireland as well. Can I have an assurance from the Minister when it comes to any plans for offshore wind, that the fishing organisations in Northern Ireland and down in Scotland and Wales will all have an input into where that happens, so that when it comes to fishing, that they won't be affected?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, the honourable gentleman makes a very good point that obviously in sparking a floating offshore wind industry, there are certain challenges that need to be dealt with amongst various other government departments. The honourable gentleman has made reference to one. I can assure him I've already had informal discussions about that, and we'll be looking to have more formal discussions with DEFRA and other government departments to make sure that we can overcome all of the challenges that are there and create a vibrant, sustainable industry for the future.
Alex Cunningham.
Question number 8, please.
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I have regular discussions with Cabinet colleagues on a variety of issues, including on the cost of energy bills. The Government recognises the challenges posed by the cost of living pressures, which is why we are providing £3,700 per household on average over 22 to 2025 to support households and individuals with the cost of living.
Alex Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister may not be aware of the very successful Warm Wales programme in the noughties, which saw tens of thousands of homes have their cavities and lofts insulated, saving residents in Neath, Port Talbot and Wrexham hundreds of pounds every year. Does the Government recognise that concentrated schemes of this nature have a major impact on fuel poverty? And will Ministers steal our plans, which will see hundreds of thousands more households benefit?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm well aware that there are a number of renewable energy schemes that could have a positive benefit on householders in Wales, which is why the UK Government have been so supporting of the potential for floating offshore wind in the Celtic Sea, why we recently, during the last round, arranged higher strike prices for tidal energy. So we're looking at a wide range of renewable energy systems that can bring benefits to people in Wales, and at the same time recognising the cost of living pressures. The UK Government has made sure we were paying around half the average fuel bills for homeowners during the last winter period.
Alexander Stafford.
Question 9, please, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last week I had the pleasure of talking to farmers at the Royal Welsh Winter Fair and livestock markets in Sennybridge and Talabont in my own constituency. The UK Government is committed to backing Welsh farming, most notably by allocating over £900 million to the Welsh Government. This delivers on our manifesto commitment to maintain funding to farmers and land managers at 2019 levels.
Alexander Stafford.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. Farmers across the UK, from those in the country of Wales to the village of Wales and Rwanda Valley, face increasing pressures. The Minister will know that I'm holding my next Farmers Forum with the Farming Minister early next year in Rwanda Valley. But what is she doing to support farmers in the country of Wales, farmers in the village of Wales and Rwanda Valley, and farmers across the whole of Rwanda Valley and the whole of the UK?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I congratulate my honourable friend on his work ensuring that the voice of farming is heard by the Minister. My honourable friend, like me, understands that farmers across this country are the beating heart of the rural economy, driving growth in rural constituencies like mine, which I must say is in stark contrast to the attitude of the party opposite in Wales, who have already cut £37 million from the Welsh agriculture budget. We wait with trepidation, Madam Deputy Speaker, to see what damage they will do to Welsh farmers next week.
Alexander Stafford. Stephen Doughty.
With the Minister.
I think it just proves a point that members are not paying the least bit of attention to this colleague who is about to speak, who couldn't even hear his name being called. It's really rude to keep on talking when someone else is trying to ask an important question. Stephen Doughty.
Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you for your generosity, and may I also pay tribute to my very good friends in the Kinnock family on the loss of Glenys, who was a dear friend to all of us, and also on the sad death of the former member for Rhondda. Can I ask the Secretary of State, constituents in Cardiff South and Penarth, number 11.
He really has to do number 11. Minister.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Here. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you. This is going well. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With your permission, I will answer questions 11 and 12 together. The UK Government is committed to building a strong rail infrastructure network across Wales, which will improve connectivity and drive economic growth.
Seeing Cardiff South and Penarth want to see a station built in St Mellons Parkway. That will require important work on the South Wales main line for relief lines. Will she meet with me and colleagues with the Rail Minister to make sure that important national investment is done to ensure that station can go ahead?
I'd be delighted to meet with the honourable gentleman to discuss that and the investment that the UK Government is already putting into rail infrastructure in Wales.
Chris Armour.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State and the Minister should know that I've campaigned for years to close the dangerous level crossing in Pencoed in my Ogmore constituency. There's been no levelling up funding, no transport bid funding approved for any of those applications. Can the Minister please talk to DfT officials to resolve this, rather than allowing DfT officials to keep announcing more and more rail services, which is closes the crossing by stealth? It's not acceptable for my constituents.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I worked very well with the honourable gentleman when I was in the Government Whip's office, and I very much look forward to doing so. So I will certainly write to him and offer a meeting to discuss that.
Order. That concludes questions to the Secretary of State for Wales. And just before we proceed to Prime Minister's questions, many colleagues have asked me to pass on their best wishes to Mr. Speaker in his absence. I'm happy to inform the House that although Mr. Speaker has tested positive for COVID and therefore can't be present here in the chamber, he is rapidly getting better, and just as soon as that little test shows negative, he'll be straight back here in his chair. And so we proceed to questions to the Prime Minister. Sir Michael Fabricant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Question number 1.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I welcome you to your place, and I know the whole House will wish the Speaker a speedy recovery. And before I answer my honourable friend's question, I know the whole House will also want to join me in offering our condolences to the family and friends of Alistair Darling, Glenys Kinnock and Lord James Douglas Hamilton. They made each an enormous contribution to public life and will be deeply missed. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Hillsborough families have suffered multiple injustices. The loss of 97 lives, the blaming of the fans and the unforgivable institutional defensiveness by public bodies. I'm profoundly sorry for what they have been through. Today, the Government has published its response to Bishop James Jones's report to ensure the pain and the suffering of the Hillsborough families is not repeated. I'm immensely grateful they have shared their experiences. I hope to meet them in the new year, and the Justice Secretary will be making an oral statement after PMQs. Turning to honourable friend's question, the Government is continuing to work closely with the Mayor of the West Midlands to fully develop his plans to deliver growth.
Sir Michael Fabricant.
Well, firstly, may I join the Prime Minister in his comments about the Hillsborough families. It's thanks to Margaret Thatcher and her robust treatment of militant trade unions in the West Midlands, her contribution of £10 billion at today's prices to the motor industry in the West Midlands, that iconic names like Jaguar and Land Rover still exist. So does the Prime Minister share my boundless joy that on the road to Damascus, and in recognition of her great heritage and all that she achieved, another fanboy has joined her great belief, the leader of the opposition.
Prime Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the right honourable gentleman is a fantastic champion of his area, and because of the pro-business policies of this government, I'm delighted to see the billions of pounds of investment by JLR in their move towards electrification in the region. But he is absolutely right. I am always happy to welcome new Thatcherites from all sides of this House. But it does say something about the leader of the opposition that the main female strong leader that he could praise is Margaret Thatcher and not his own fantastic deputy.
Since question 1 was a closed question, we now go to question 2, Sarah Champion.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Question number 2.
Madam Deputy Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Sarah Champion.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Government is set to close the Household Support Scheme in March. cutting off crucial free meals for 12,000 Rotherham's children in the lowest income families. With the government's cost of living crisis in full swing and energy prices about to increase again, how does the Prime Minister justify taking food from the mouths of my poorest children?
Madam Deputy Speaker, what we are doing is ensuring that no child should grow up in poverty, and that's why not only this year we've provided considerable cost of living support worth over £3,000 to a typical household, more support this winter for pensioners, a record increase in the national living wage, and a full indexation and uplifting of welfare for the next financial year. But when it comes to children and food, Madam Deputy Speaker, not only do we fund the free school meals for almost 2 million children, we also introduced the Holiday Activity and Food Programme, which provides not just food but enriching activities to deprived children up and down the entire country, including in her local authority.
Caroline Ansell.
If there is one place where everyone should feel safe, it's in their own home. But the reality is that for some of the most vulnerable people, home is precisely where they can be most at risk. Terrorised by criminals who target them, move in, take control, and set up a base camp from where they sell drugs or facilitate prostitution in a horrendous form of exploitation known as cuckooing. It has happened in Eastbourne, and it is happening across the country. It is not an offence, but it should be, and wasn't cited in the Criminal Justice Bill debated last week. So can I ask my right honourable friend and the Home Secretary if they would meet with me and concerned colleagues to further discuss the issue?
Right.
I agree with my honourable friend that cuckooing is an abhorrent practice that does often prey on the most vulnerable in society. As part of the government's antisocial behaviour action plan, the Home Office engaged with relevant stakeholders about whether a new criminal offence was necessary. The results of that engagement demonstrated that there are a range of existing powers that can be used to disrupt this activity, but of course I'll ensure that the relevant minister meets with her and updates on the work we are doing to share effective practice to tackle this abhorrent problem.
Leader of the Opposition, Sir Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's very good to see you in your place, and we wish the Speaker a speedy recovery. This week we lost two giants of the Labour family, and I thank the Prime Minister for his comments. Alistair Darling was a man of unassuming intelligence, warmth and kindness. He brought a calm expertise and, in private, a cutting wit, and devoted his love of his family was ever present. Our thoughts are with Maggie, his wife, Callum, Anna, who he loved so dearly. Glenys Kinnock was a passionate campaigner for social justice who changed lives home and abroad. She was a loving and supportive partner and mother, and her death is a huge loss to all of us. We are thinking of Neil, of Stephen, Rachel, and of all the family. Can I also echo the Prime Minister's comments in relation to Lord Douglas Hamilton and in relation to the Hillsborough families? They deserve justice. In a previous capacity, I worked with the families. They waited a very, very long time for the findings, thanks to people in this House, and they've waited a long time for this response, but I'm glad it is now coming. Madam Deputy Speaker, if the purpose of the Rwanda gimmick was to solve a political headache of the Tories' own making, to get people out of the country who they simply couldn't deal with, then it's been a resounding success. After all, they've managed to send 3 Home Secretaries there, an achievement for which the whole country can be grateful. So, apart from members of his own cabinet, how many people has the Prime Minister sent to Rwanda?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, as I've been clear before, we will do everything it takes. Mr. Speaker, we will do everything it takes to get this scheme working so that we can indeed stop the boats. And that's why this week we have signed a new legally binding treaty with Rwanda, which together with new legislation will address all the concerns that have been raised, because everyone should be in no doubt about our absolute commitment to stop the boats and get flights off. Because, Madam Deputy Speaker, and this is the crucial point that the Honourable Gentleman doesn't understand, deterrence is critical. Even the National Crime Agency have said that you need an effective removals and deterrence agreement if you truly want to break the cycle of tragedy that we see. But what we heard this morning from his own ministers was that they would scrap the scheme even when it is operational and working. Once again, Mr. Speaker, instead of being on the side of the British people, he finds himself on the side of the people smugglers.
Madam Deputy Speaker, when they first announced this gimmick, they claimed Rwanda would settle tens of thousands of people. Then the Deputy former Prime Minister quickly whittled it down to mere hundreds. Then the Court of Appeal in June made clear there's housing for just 100. The current number of people sent there remains stubbornly consistent, 0. At the same time, Madam Deputy, Article 19 of the treaty says the parties shall make arrangements for the United Kingdom to resettle a portion of Rwanda's most vulnerable refugees in the United Kingdom. So how many refugees from Rwanda will be coming here to the UK under the treaty?
Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, sorry.
Order! Prime Minister.
It addresses all the concerns of the Supreme Court. But it's a point of pride, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we are a compassionate country that does welcome people from around the world. But let me just get the Honourable Gentleman up to speed on what we are doing. Reduce the number of illegal arrivals from Albania by 90%. Increase the number of illegal working raids by 50%. Because of all the action, we've taken the number of small boat arrivals down by a third, Madam Deputy Speaker. But what is the Honourable Gentleman's plan? Because it comes down to he just simply doesn't have a plan to address this problem. But no, I'm probably being unfair because he does have a plan. It's to cook up a deal with the EU that would see us accept 100,000 illegal migrants.
Migration's trebled on his watch, and all he can do is make up numbers about the Labour Party. It's really pitiful. I'm not actually sure the Prime Minister can have read this thing. Article 4 says the scheme is capped at Rwanda's capacity. That's 100. Article 5 says Rwanda can turn them away if they want. Article 19 says we actually have to take refugees from Rwanda. How much did this fantastic deal cost us?
Prime Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as the Home Secretary was crystal clear about, there is no incremental money. There is no incremental money that has been provided. This about is ensuring that the concerns of the Supreme Court have all been addressed in a legally binding treaty that will allow us to operationalise the scheme. But I'm glad he raised the topic of legal migration, which I agree is absolutely far too high, Madam Deputy Speaker. That's why this week we've outlined a plan bigger than any other government before to reduce the levels of legal migration by £300. It's an incredibly comprehensive plan. So if he cares so much about it, the simple question for him is, does he support the plan?
Madam Deputy Speaker, he clearly hasn't read it. Annex A says on top of the 140 million he's already showered on Rwanda, when we send people there under this treaty, we have to pay for their accommodation and their upkeep for 5 years. And that's not all. This morning, a government minister admitted that anyone we send to Rwanda who commits a crime can be returned to us. I'm beginning to see why the Home Secretary said the Rwanda scheme is something to do with bats, I think, wasn't it? What does he first think attracted Mr. Kagame to hundreds of millions of pounds for nothing in return?
Listen, I've slightly lost the thread of the question, Madam Deputy Speaker, but the simple point the simple point is, there's a simple question here. If you believe in stopping the boats, as we on this side of the House do, you need to have an effective deterrence and returns agreement. It's as simple as that. The honourable gentleman is not interested in stopping the boats, which is why he's not interested in the Rwanda plan. In fact, Madam Deputy Speaker, we know that they don't want to tackle this issue, because even when this government was trying to deport foreign national offenders out of this country, they opposed it. Multiple members of his shadow front bench all signed a letter to me to that effect. But I don't need to tell him that, because he signed it too.
Okay, that's enough. Sir Keir Starmer.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I would say that this treaty's got more holes in than a Swiss cheese, but I don't want to wind up the Prime Minister by talking about a European country again. Madam Deputy Speaker, you have to give credit to the Rwandan government. They saw this Prime Minister coming a mile off. You can only imagine their delight, their sheer disbelief, when having already banked £140 million of British taxpayer money without housing a single asylum seeker, the Prime Minister appears again with another offer they can't refuse. A gimmick that will send taxpayers' money to Rwanda, refugees from Rwanda to Britain, and won't stop the boats. It was mentioned of Margaret Thatcher earlier. How, Madam Deputy Speaker,
there's understandable excitement about the mention of May, but the House must listen to the Leader of the Opposition, Sir Keir Starmer.
Party go from up yours to laws to take our money, Kigami.
Mr. Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, when it comes to this European thing and Margaret Thatcher, this is the week that the Shadow Foreign Secretary, I think, didn't rule out rejoining the European Union. He can role-play Margaret Thatcher all he wants, but when it comes to Europe, his answer's the same. Yes, yes, yes!
Madam Deputy Speaker, forget the private jet. He's obviously on a private planet of his own. But as Daily Mail readers learned this week that the Prime Minister has begun to feel sorry for himself. He's even been heard comparing his plight to his beloved Southampton Football Club. I do think that's a bit harsh, because Saints have been on an 11-game unbeaten run, while, as the song has it, the Prime Minister gets battered everywhere he goes. But if you want the perfect example of how badly the Tories have broken the asylum system, last week the Home Office admitted that 17,000 people in the asylum system...
Order! Come on. Sir Keir Starmer.
Thank you. If you want the perfect example of how badly they've broken the asylum system, Madam Deputy Speaker, last week the Home Office admitted that 17,000 people in the asylum system have disappeared. Their exact words, it's hard to believe this, we don't think we know where all these people are. Now, you might lose your car keys, you might lose your headphones, you might lose your marbles. How do you lose 17,000 people?
Prime Minister!
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, on the topic of football teams, he used to describe this Rwanda policy as immoral, and yet his football team has a Visit Rwanda badge on the side of them. But in the week when he made his big economy speech, we're still waiting to hear how he's going to borrow £28 billion and still cut taxes and reduce debt. It's the same old thing. The sums don't add up. But while they're struggling with their calculator, we're getting on and delivering a new treaty with Rwanda.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'm getting fed up with sitting in traffic jams in my constituency caused by contractors digging up roads, involving lane closures and temporary traffic lights, often invoking utility company emergency powers that turn out not to be emergencies, and often with no sign of anybody doing any work, particularly over weekends. So I set up a campaign to name and shame these inconsiderate contractors. But it turns out that when they cause all this chaos, when they breach the rules of their permit, the maximum penalty is an £80 fixed penalty notice. So will the Prime Minister back my campaign and support better enforcement and realistic levels of fine?
Well, my honourable friend makes an excellent point, and that's why we've set aside £8 billion as a result of our plans on HS2, Madam Deputy Speaker, which is enough to resurface over 5,000 miles of road to improve journeys, a cornerstone of our plan. But also, we are introducing a range of measures, as the Honourable Gentleman says, to reduce congestion from roadworks. Contained in the plan for drivers is a scheme for greater fines and penalties to ensure that works do finish on time, and I'll make sure that we look at his suggestion, and I wholeheartedly back his campaign.
Leader of the Scottish Nationalists, Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Is the Prime Minister worried that he is projected to be the first Conservative Party leader to lose a general election to a fellow Thatcherite?
We really must hear the Prime Minister, and we've got a lot of questions to get through. It's not the Prime Minister's opponents who are giving him trouble. Prime Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I say to the Honourable Gentleman, Margaret Thatcher's view was cut inflation, then cut taxes, and then win an election, and that's very much my plan.
Of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's not just in relation to Margaret Thatcher where the Tory and Labour leader appear to agree. The same is true of the government's latest migration policies. Now, for those of us on these benches, we aren't afraid to say that we believe migration is a good thing. It enriches our communities, it enriches our economy, it enriches our universities, our schools, our health service and, of course, our care sector. So in that regard, can I ask the Prime Minister, why does he think it is acceptable to ask people to come to these shores to care for our family members, whilst we show complete disregard for theirs? What has become of this place?
Well, Madam Speaker, it's completely wrong. No, as we've already said, we have a proud track record of welcoming those who are most vulnerable around the world. Over 500,000 over the past few years from Syria, Afghanistan, Ukraine, Hong Kong and elsewhere, and that's what this country will always do. But at the same time, when it comes to economic migration and other forms, it's absolutely right that we take strong action to curb the levels that we have seen, because they are simply far too high and place unsustainable pressure on our public services. And, Madam Speaker, I make no apology for saying that, or indeed saying that it is important that those who come here contribute to our public services.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I first of all welcome the Government's significant funding increase for two-year-olds preschooling in 2023. But the illustrative 24-25 DFE funding to Dorset Council for two-year-olds preschooling is looking to be a net 17 pence per hour less than it is today, and it is giving West Dorset preschools some nervousness about their sustainability. Will my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, support me to ensure that educational funding formulas for this will be taking into account the challenges of rural living and allow excellent preschools to...
Got it, Prime Minister.
Deputy Speaker, but in a couple of years' time, we'll have increased spending to over £8 billion every year on free hours and early education, which will help working families with childcare costs. Indeed, it's the single biggest investment in childcare in England ever. But my honourable friend makes an excellent point, and that's why we will ensure that there is a discretionary supplement in the local authorities' local funding formula for rural communities to account for the smaller economies of scale and ensure that they can continue to deliver their very vital work.
Stephen Farry.
9 months on from the Windsor Framework, I thank the Prime Minister for his ongoing efforts to restore the Northern Ireland Assembly and Executive. However, if and when the institutions are restored, they will still be plagued by the same structural weaknesses that have seen repeated collapses and unfairness around things like designations. This week, the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee published a report calling for a review of the Good Friday Agreement. Many architects of the agreement, such as Tony Blair, John Major and Bertie Ahern, have recognised the case for reform. So can the Prime Minister commit to an early review of the agreement to improve its stability, effectiveness and fairness?
Prime Minister.
So I recognise the honourable member's campaigning on this issue, and I've got great respect for his position. Indeed, we've spoken on a number of occasions, both here and on my visits to Northern Ireland. My focus right now is on getting the institutions up and running, and my overarching priority is to get public services back on track in Northern Ireland, which I know is an ambition that he and I share. Any reform of institutions are best dealt with the support of all parts of the community. But when it comes to restoring the current institutions, the government is doing everything it can to support efforts, and I know the Secretary of State will be in touch and engagement with the parties imminently on that point.
Nick Fletcher.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yesterday, 13 men died by suicide. Today, 88 men will die of heart disease. Tomorrow, and every day, 90,000 men will wake up in prison. And we have 2.2 million boys living today at home with no dad. We thankfully have an excellent Cabinet Minister for Women. We have an excellent Minister for Women. So will the Prime Minister meet with me to discuss the merits of a Minister for Men and Boys? Because, as Warren Farrell states, when one sex loses, both sex lose.
Yay. Can I say to my honourable friend that he should be commended for his tireless campaigning on this issue. He's particularly right to focus on suicide, and that's why I'm grateful for his engagement with the suicide prevention strategy, which sets out the actions that we will take to reduce suicides in the coming years. But it's also a thanks partly into his campaigning that on International Men's Day, we announced that we're appointing the first men's health ambassador and launching a men's health task force, and I look forward to continued collaboration with him so that we can represent his concerns adequately.
Simon Lightwood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Convicted criminals are being held in police station cells across West Yorkshire because this government has completely failed to deliver more prison places. Two-thirds of prisons overcrowded, criminals let out early, if sentenced at all, only 2% of rapists reaching court, serious violence up 60%, knife crime up by 70%, and nearly 65,000 cases waiting to be heard. So, Prime Minister, how can you reassure the residents of Wakefield that they are safe on our streets?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, we have a clear plan to protect victims, punish criminals and cut crime. We're investing £400 million more, in fact, in prison places, on top of the £4 billion that I announced as Chancellor, which is delivering 20,000 new cells. We're also making sure that rapists serve every day of their sentences and ensuring that life means life for the worst offenders, something that I hope that the Labour Party will be supporting soon.
Sir Oliver Heald.
My constituents, Kerry and Francis Menai-Davis, are in the public gallery today, and they lost their son after a long battle with cancer where they visited him in hospital every day. They've set up a charity called It's Never You to help parents in that situation, and on Monday I intend to present a bill which would ask the government to report on what support can be given to parents in that situation, and I hope he might ask ministers to discuss this with me so that we can find a way forward to help parents in this dreadful situation.
Well, can I express my sympathies to my royal friends' constituents for what they have been through and commend them for setting up the It's Never You charity. I will ensure that the organisers and he get the appropriate meeting with the Minister to discuss their important work. He's absolutely right. Parents that are in that situation should have all the support that they need, and we'll make sure that that happens.
Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. 1 in 5 of my residents live in fuel poverty, and this winter looks to be the most brutal yet, according to Cornwall Insights, with the current trajectory in energy prices expected to be the new norm for the rest of the decade. As the Prime Minister will know, one of the best ways to support households would be the introduction of a social tariff. He promised a consultation by summer this year. We're still waiting. When will the consultation be released?
Madam Deputy Speaker, we've also provided considerable support in the here and now for households with their energy bills. £900 of direct cost of living support this financial year on top of a record increase in benefits, along with winter fuel payments of up to £300 this winter for pensioners because they're particularly vulnerable. And we will continue to look at all support that we have to ensure that those who need it are getting the help that they deserve.
Andrew Selous.
COP28, will the Prime Minister salute South West Bedfordshire's contribution to our nation's energy security for having had the tallest wind turbine in England, the largest battery in Europe, and now the most powerful wind turbine in England, which has local support? And can we also ensure that my constituents now get cheaper energy bills for hosting this vital infrastructure?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I can say that we are looking exactly at how local communities can benefit when new infrastructure is in their vicinity as part of our new plan for increased energy security. But also, can I commend his local area for the contribution they're making to our clean energy transition? It's a great example of this country's fantastic track record in delivering net zero and decarbonising faster than any other major economy. Not something that you'll hear from the party opposite, but something that we on this side of the House are very proud of.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Government failed on their legal duty to publish a report on spiking by April, stating that they were reconsidering whether their rationale for not introducing a specific offence for spiking was sound. Will the Prime Minister clarify when and if this spiking report will ever be published? And does he agree with me and colleagues right across this House that the only sound approach to this issue is to create a specific criminal offence for spiking?
Madam Deputy Speaker, this is an issue that has been reviewed by legal police colleagues. My latest understanding is that the existing laws did cover the offence of spiking, but of course I'm happy to ensure that she gets a letter which explains the position.
Paul Holmes.
Very kind. Not content with being the third most indebted council in England with a debt of 670 million, Lib Dem Eastleigh Borough Council recently refinanced their failed One Horton Heath housing project to the tune of £148 million with no houses built and interest payments of £386,000 per month. Will the Prime Minister now ask Dulac to intervene and independently investigate this development and ask for a meeting with the Minister relevant to discuss this terrible decision by Eastleigh Borough Council?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I am aware that some local authorities, including the one he mentioned, have taken excessive risks with borrowing and investment practices. That's why we've taken a range of measures to strengthen the regulatory framework to prevent this from happening, and that includes new powers that make it quicker and easier for the government to step in when councils do take on excessive risk through borrowing. I'll ensure that he gets a meeting with the relevant minister to raise his concerns, because his constituents deserve better.
Mary Glendon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. National Energy Action says 13% of North Tynesiders are in fuel poverty. 3,000 homes have legacy prepayment meters, and we are in the bottom 5% for energy efficiency. But the Chancellor announced no new funding to help people this winter. We're now in Advent, so what Christmas message does the Prime Minister have for my constituents who are freezing in their homes?
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I've outlined, we've provided considerable support for particularly vulnerable families this year and through this winter. We're also investing record sums in improving the energy efficiency and insulation of vulnerable homes through our home upgrade scheme and indeed the Warm Homes discount, which on average can save people hundreds of pounds in their energy bills when they receive that support, and we're expanding those programmes across the country, including in the North East.
Flick Drummond.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The International Criminal Court prosecutor, Karim Khan, KC, has concluded his first visit to Israel and Palestine and stated we must show that the law is there on the front lines and it's capable of protecting all. What support will Britain offer to the International Criminal Court to conduct investigations into the conduct of all parties in Israel, Gaza and the West Bank before and since October the 7th?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, as is well known, we are a strong and long-standing supporter of the International Criminal Court. When it comes to the situation in Gaza, we have been consistent in saying that international humanitarian law has to be respected. All parties must take every possible step to avoid harming civilians, and I can say that I stressed this point specifically just yesterday to Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Gregory Campbell.
Thank you. The Prime Minister is aware that the household tax known as the television licence fee is due to rise in April in line with inflation. Given the ongoing household budget constraints that all our constituents are faced with, increasing childcare costs, as well as ongoing unresolved staffing issues at BBC Northern Ireland, National BBC Television, National BBC Radio, is now not the right time to proceed with an even larger £3.7 billion licence fee budget enhanced yet again?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, we have already agreed a fair settlement with the BBC that will see the licence fee remain frozen until 2024. I think the honourable member raises an excellent point, and I've been clear that the licence fee in the BBC needs to be realistic about what is possible in an environment like this, and it should only rise at a level that people can actually afford. The Culture Secretary has said we're looking at this issue right now, and she'll set out more detail in due course.
Jack Burton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Longton, which is the largest town in my constituency, has not benefited from future high streets funding, from town deals, or the latest long-term plan for towns. So will my right honourable friend ensure that we can have some investment into Longton from the government, and particularly does he agree with me that the latest award of HLF money to Stoke-on-Trent, some of that should definitely be invested in Longton?
My honourable friend is a tireless champion for his local community, and I know there has been considerable investment in his area over the past few years in lots of different ways. He makes an excellent point about making sure that nobody misses out from the considerable resources that are being invested in Stoke, and I'll ensure that the Levelling Up Department takes his concerns very seriously.
We are running way over time, but I appreciate it would be great disappointment to people whose names are on the order paper if they're not called. So I'm trying my best to call everyone whose name is on the order paper, but I make a plea for brevity. Please. Kerry McCarthy.
Thank you. When the Prime Minister is taking a dip in his pool or he's on the beach at his place in California, he doesn't have to worry about swimming in sewage. The rest of us don't have it so good. So why won't he back Labour's plans for criminal liability for water company bosses who failed to clean up their act?
Madam Deputy Speaker, we've already brought forward regulations that ensure there can be unlimited fines for water companies, and there have been dozens of criminal prosecutions. But what I would say is, when we had a plan, when we had a debate in this House on exactly a plan that would do all of this, who didn't show up to vote? It was the Labour Party.
James Sunderland.
Very good point. Madam Deputy Speaker, in recent weeks I have seen firsthand the extraordinary work conducted by specialist care staff at accident and emergency. As politicians, we are often guilty of using the NHS as a political football, but when it becomes personal, one is reminded that what we have in the UK is very special. Will the Prime Minister join me in simply thanking our superb NHS staff in Bracknell, across Berkshire, in neighbouring Basingstoke and Printing Park hospitals and beyond?
Madam Deputy Speaker, NHS staff are at the heart of what makes our health service work. There wouldn't be an NHS without them. Their skill, their expertise, their dedication. I was delighted that I could pay them my thanks last week in person, and I join my honourable friend in thanking NHS staff, not just in his constituency, but right across the country, for their dedicated hard work and public service.
Dame Nia Griffith.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, it's now 6 years since Bishop James Jones published the Hillsborough Report, and only today, finally, do we get the government response. But when will the government introduce not just a voluntary charter or an independent public advocate or a code for ethical policing, but a full Hillsborough law to force those in public office to cooperate fully with investigations and to guarantee fairer funding for those affected by major tragedy to challenge public institutions?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, as I've said, I'm profoundly sorry for what the Hillsborough families have been through, and as I said, my honourable friend, the Justice Secretary, will be making a full statement immediately after PMQs.
Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I refer members to my registered member's interest. As someone who has worked as a junior doctor I understand it's a demanding job and I have sympathy with the challenges they face. However, the strikes that are planned over the festive period threaten public safety and they will delay people's treatment. Causing patient suffering in the pursuit of more money for oneself is, in my view, morally indefensible. Can the Prime Minister tell the House what concrete steps he is taking to prevent these strikes and whether he'll bring forward minimum service legislation to protect patients in case they do?
Now, my honourable friend makes an excellent point and speaks from a position of experience on this issue. The government has now reached settlements with every other part of the public sector, including most recently consultants, and I'm grateful to them for their constructive engagement with the government. The junior doctors are taking action in the face of a recommendation from an independent body of a 9% pay rise on average, the highest increase across the entire public sector. The government has gone beyond that in conversations with them, and they have still decided to take damaging strike action. It is wrong, and that is why we've introduced minimum service levels to ensure that we can guarantee a safe level of care for patients across the NHS. And it would be good to hear at some point from the Labour Party whether we'll get off the fence, condemn these strikes, and back these minimum service laws.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Universal credit is broken. One constituent tells me that DWP is refusing to reimburse her childcare payments because it was 4 days late due to her phone being broken. She's down £1,200, unable to pay for childcare. She has lost her job and is likely to have to move house. With 3 weeks to go before Christmas, she is extremely anxious and distressed. Does the Prime Minister realise the real consequences for real people of this broken system?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm sorry to hear about the circumstances of the Honourable Lady's constituent, and if she writes, I'll make sure that we get specific support in place for her and ensure that she gets access to what she needs. But when it comes to universal credit, I do strongly disagree with her, in fact. It was only because of the actions of the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green that universal credit was implemented, and it is the only reason we were able to get support to millions of vulnerable people through the pandemic. It was because we replaced the legacy system with universal credit that was possible, and it was opposed at every step by the Labour Party.
Simon Baines.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is always a pleasure to work closely with my right honourable friend, the member for Montgomeryshire, in delivering important projects like the Llanymynech Pant bypass on the border with North Shropshire, and today is another example of our partnership. As my right honourable friend is unfortunately unable to ask a question in his role as the Prime Minister's PPS, would the Prime Minister join me in highlighting his work with the FUW, the Farmers Union of Wales, in organising the terrific celebrations of Montgomeryshire Day in the Jubilee Room straight after questions?
Madam Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend is an excellent campaigner for his constituents, as indeed is the right honourable friend, the member for Montgomeryshire. It's fantastic to see these local projects being delivered in their area. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for teaching me how to pronounce the Llanymynech bypass in my first budget, and I'm delighted to declare from the dispatch box that today is now officially Montgomeryshire Day, and I look forward to everyone celebrating in the Jubilee Room straight after questions. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Final question, Gerald Jones.
Madam Deputy Speaker, if I could beg your indulgence just briefly to wish my constituent attacked during yesterday's serious incident in Aberfan a speedy recovery, and thank the emergency services and school staff for their swift and professional response. Madam Deputy Speaker, Britain is getting smaller on the world stage under this Prime Minister's watch. His climate failures mean our children and grandchildren bearing the brunt of the costs. His plans are undermining Britain's energy security. Bills are still sky high for working families, and yet he's hiking the tax burden and real living standards are falling by over 3%. Tinkering with a reset just isn't and doesn't compensate for 13 years of failure, does it, Prime Minister?
Deputy Speaker, first of all, can I say that my thoughts are with the victim and her family about the awful incident that took place on the streets of Aberfan. We wish them a full and speedy recovery, and I also join him in thanking the emergency services for their immediate response. But he talked about leaving our children and our grandchildren with costs. And he actually is right, Madam Deputy Speaker, to raise that, because that is important that we don't do that. And the question then for him and the party opposite is, why do they want to embark on a green borrowing spree of £28 billion a year that just means higher taxes for our children and our grandchildren, higher mortgage rates? It's the same old story, reckless borrowing and the British people paying the price.
Thank you. That concludes Prime Minister's questions. I'm pausing for a moment to allow members to leave and to take up new places, as we now have an important statement. And now that everyone is in place, I would ask members who are leaving to do so quietly, to do so quietly, please. A little bit of politeness to others goes a long way. Statement, the Lord Chancellor.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And with permission, I would like to make a statement on the Government's response to Bishop James Jones's report, The Patronising Disposition of Unaccountable Power, a report to ensure the pain and suffering of the Hillsborough families is not repeated, and on the steps we will take to respond to the points of learning contained therein. Madam Deputy Speaker, Bishop James has done our nation a great service, and his report is an exceptional piece of work. I want to salute the Hillsborough families for the assiduous care that they have given to help create this report and forge the response that flows from it. I had the privilege of meeting many of the families in Liverpool in June this year, alongside the former Home Secretary. I was deeply moved to hear of their experiences and by the dignity with which they shared them. But perhaps even more affecting was their unflinching determination to make sense of the senseless and bring about change for others. That is the true mark of compassion, campaigning selflessly for change, knowing that nothing that any government can do will bring back their own loved ones or temper their grief. The Hillsborough families have, through their determined efforts over decades, created a lasting legacy, a national legacy, that is a tribute to their loved ones. At the start of his report, Bishop James expressed his hope that we might be a better nation for having listened to them. We are, and they deserve the thanks of our nation. Second, I also pay tribute to those in this House who continue to campaign on behalf of the Hillsborough families and for families bereaved by other tragedies, including the member for Garston and Halewood, Halton, Wirral South and Liverpool West Derby. I thank former members of the House who have given important support to the families, including Steve Rotherham and Andy Burnham, and I of course thank the former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead. Quite apart, and I thank Glenn Taylor, indeed, for his vital work on the ongoing independent forensic pathology review. Quite apart from its important recommendations, Bishop James's report laid bare the truly devastating experiences of those bereaved by the Hillsborough disaster on the 15th of April 1989. An unimaginable tragedy unfolded. 97 innocent men, women and children ultimately lost their lives. Hundreds more were injured and traumatised by what they saw. But for Hillsborough's bereaved and survivors, that terrible day was only day one of an enduring ordeal. And in the days and decades thereafter, it became clear they suffered a double injustice. First, there was the abject failure of the police and others at the ground to protect their loved ones, failures described in Lord Justice Taylor's 1990 report as, quote, blunders of the first magnitude. Then they faced years of unforgivable institutional defensiveness. Second, the Hillsborough's families and survivors suffered what can only be described as cruelty, as innocent fans were cynically blamed for their own deaths. But that, Madam Deputy Speaker, as was later to become clear, was a web of lies spun by those seeking to protect their own reputations. Now, I emphasise that point because although the disaster may have been over 34 years ago, these baseless narratives still inexplicably persist in some quarters today. So let me take this important opportunity to restate what is not a matter of opinion, but unassailable fact. Fans attending the Hillsborough Stadium on the 15th of April 1989 bear absolutely no responsibility for the deaths and injuries that occurred. And in making that statement, I echo what was said 7 years ago by my right honourable friend, the member for Maidenhead, at this dispatch box when she read out the full findings of the second inquests, namely that 96 men, women and children were unlawfully killed. Since then, Andrew Devine, who suffered life-changing injuries at Hillsborough, passed away on the 27th of July 2021, becoming the 97th fatality of the disaster. I would like to place on record my deepest sympathies to Mr. Devine's family and friends, and indeed all those who lost loved ones. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Government's response to Bishop James's report has been a long time coming, too long. For some of that time, it was necessarily held back to avoid prejudicing the outcomes of criminal trials, but there has been delay since, and I recognise that this has only compounded the pain of the Hillsborough families and survivors, and the Government apologises for that. As the House will be aware, the Government's response follows that of the police, which was published in January this year. Today, the Chief Coroner is also publishing his response, which relates to his leadership role regarding the coronial service, and collectively, these responses address the points raised by Bishop James. But this doesn't stop here. We will, of course, continue to listen to the families of those involved in all major incidents and their concerns. So turning to the report, it contains 25 points of learning. Whilst Bishop James said that he considered each to be vitally important, he was clear that 3 in particular were, in his words, crucial. So let me turn to those. First, he proposed the creation of a charter for families bereaved through public tragedy. Bishop James made clear that he wanted to, quote, help bring about cultural change through commitments to change, as he put it, related to transparency and acting in the public interest. It's worth reflecting that in setting out Point of Learning 13 regarding the Hillsborough Law, which I will come on to, Bishop James said that he had drawn heavily on that law's principles in the drafting of this charter. So it is worth taking a moment to consider the language of that charter. It commits signatories, the leaders of public bodies, to strive to, 1, place the public interest above the reputation of their own organisations. 2, to approach all forms of public scrutiny, including public inquiries and inquests, with candour in an open, honest and transparent way. And 3, to avoid seeking to defend the indefensible. And I can tell the House that the Deputy Prime Minister has today signed what will be known as the Hillsborough Charter on behalf of the Government. Other signatories of the Charter include the National Police Chiefs Council on behalf of all 43 police forces, the College of Policing, the Crown Prosecution Service, the National Fire Chiefs Council and others. We want this charter to become part of the culture of what it means to be a public servant in Britain. So the Deputy Prime Minister will be writing to all departments to ensure that everyone who works in government is aware of the Hillsborough Charter and what it means for the way that they work. A reference to the Charter will also be added to the central induction to the civil service for all new joiners. The Hillsborough Charter and indeed Bishop James's report have also been added to the curriculum for every recruit who joins the police. This charter will now be indeed embedded in our public life. Now, the second crucial point of learning from Bishop James's report is what he described as the pressing need for proper participation of bereaved families at inquests. Now, inquests are, as we know, first and foremost about answering 4 questions: who, where, when and how an individual has died. But as Bishop James highlighted, the Hillsborough families were let down by the very process that should have given them answers during the first inquests, and then they had to endure a second, which had been ordered by my right honourable friend. At the first inquests, the families were forced to fund their own legal representation, a single barrister between them. We recognise that proper involvement in an inquest will, in appropriate cases, mean that bereaved families should get legal representation, especially when the state is represented. And that's why changes have been made such that had the Hillsborough tragedy happened today, the families would have been eligible for free legal aid through the exceptional case funding scheme. The Government is determined to make this process as straightforward as possible, and that is why in January 2022, the Ministry of Justice removed the means test for representation in relation to ECF cases, and in September 2023, the means test was also removed for legal advice at inquests. But we want to build on this progress. So I can announce today that we will consult on an expansion of legal aid for families bereaved through public disaster, where an independent public advocate is engaged, I'll come back to that, or in the aftermath of a terrorist incident. Now, I acknowledge that Bishop James talks broadly about the proper participation of bereaved families at inquests where the state is represented. We will seek to further understand the experiences of these individuals, and I would welcome a conversation with Bishop James on this early in the new year. We also support the principle raised in Bishop James's report that public bodies should not be able to spend limitless public funds on legal representation. And that's why we have for the first time set out a requirement on government departments to consider the number of lawyers instructed, bearing in mind the commitment to support an inquisitorial approach. And we will now go on to set out that central government public bodies should publish their spend on legal representation at inquests and inquiries, reaffirming that this spend should be proportionate and never excessive. We've also published a set of principles to guide how public bodies should instruct lawyers at inquests. These include a requirement to approach the inquest with openness and honesty, and to keep in mind that the bereaved should be at the heart of the inquest process. But we will also publish guidance to set the clear expectation that central government public bodies must instruct their lawyers in accordance with the principle of the Hillsborough Charter, because how lawyers engage with the inquest process, and indeed the bereaved families, matters. So I'll turn to the third of Bishop James's three crucial points of learning: a duty of candour for police officers. As he described it, there is a gap in police accountability arrangements for officers who fail to cooperate fully with investigations into alleged criminal offences or misconduct. That is why a new offence of police corruption, applicable to police and NCA officers, was introduced in 2017, punishable by up to 14 years imprisonment. In 2020, we updated the police conduct regulations to introduce a new duty to cooperate for individual officers during investigations and inquiries. Failure to do so can result in disciplinary sanctions, including dismissal. And last month, we introduced legislation to place an organisational duty of candour on policing. Through the Criminal Justice Bill, we will place a duty on the College of Policing to issue a code of practice for ethical policing, and for that code to include the duty of candour. This duty is designed to promote a culture of openness, honesty and transparency, and chief constables will be held to account for their force's performance against the code. The new code of practice has been laid in Parliament today, and we want to go beyond the police, to consider healthcare settings too. Indeed, I can tell the House that in response to recent concerns about openness in those settings, we will also be conducting a review into the effectiveness of the existing duty of candour for health and social care providers. The terms of reference for that have been published today. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I am aware that the Hillsborough law calls for a duty of candour on all public authorities. Now, since the Hillsborough disaster, a comprehensive framework of duties and obligations has developed which cover public officials and the different official proceedings, such as inquests and inquiries. First, in central government, the Civil Service Code requires civil servants to act with honesty and integrity. A breach of these codes can result in a range of potential sanctions, including dismissal. These sit alongside the Nolan principles, providing that holders of public office should act solely in terms of the public interest. Second, the legal framework surrounding criminal investigations, statutory inquiries, inquests, and most other formal proceedings requires that all individuals, regardless of whether or not they are a public official, cooperate with them. For example, there is a duty of candour in judicial review, which amounts to a duty on public authorities to lay cards face up on the table. And when it comes to inquiries, Madam Deputy Speaker, importantly, these carry the potential for custodial sanction, prison sentences in plain English. Third, where a public official demonstrates a lack of candour, where it forms part of their duty as a public office holder, they can potentially be guilty of misconduct in public office, which is a criminal offence. Now, we will keep these changes under review to ensure we achieve that culture of openness, honesty and candour, and we will not rule out taking further action if it is needed. Madam Deputy Speaker, today the Government responds to all 25 points of learning, but I've focused this statement on those which Bishop James described as crucial. Very meaningful progress has been made. We will not hesitate to go further if required, because the discussions will continue, and indeed the Government has committed to another debate in the new year to ensure that dialogue progresses, and I will also be happy to meet the Hillsborough family should they wish to discuss any aspect of the Government's response. But Madam Deputy Speaker, let me turn finally to a really important point, which is the improvements in the justice system. Because Bishop James made searingly clear that the justice system, which should have supported victims and the bereaved after the tragedy, was not set up to do so. Now, our response sets out the steps this government has taken to make sure that bereaved families and survivors in the immediate aftermath of a public tragedy are guided through what can be a difficult, complicated and forbidding process. Through the Victims and Prisoners Bill, we have introduced legislation to enable an independent public advocate. Once established, the IPA will be a strong voice for victims, the bereaved and whole communities affected by major incidents. The IPA, as promised by my right honourable friend, will make sure those affected by major incidents know their rights, can access support services and have their voices heard at inquests and inquiries. Its design has been informed by the very difficulties that the Hillsborough families faced and our commitment to making sure that other families do not suffer the same injustices. That can include holding public bodies to account for their commitments to abide by the Hillsborough Charter. I'm also grateful for the contributions of some of the families of victims of the Grenfell Tower fire and Manchester Arena bombing for their contributions, telling us what would have helped them most in the aftermath of those terrible events. And after listening to concerns of the Hillsborough families set out so powerfully when I met them earlier this year, as well as contributions from colleagues across the House, I'm looking at the Honourable Lady for Galston, thank you, in Hellwood, I decided that we must go further by establishing a permanent independent public advocate. It is vital that the advocate can be deployed as soon as possible after disaster strikes and that they have time in advance to be as prepared as possible. A permanent advocate will be able to advise the government on its response to major incidents, such as any subsequent inquiries or reviews, and will make sure the views of families are heard. They will also, importantly, report independently to government about the experiences of victims and bereaved families, as well as publishing an annual report. All such reports will be laid before Parliament. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Hillsborough families have been unrelenting in their pursuit of justice, and Bishop James has done essential work to support the families and faithfully discharge the commission put upon him by the then Home Secretary and former Prime Minister to capture their perspective so that it was not lost following the second inquests. Today is therefore an important day. It doesn't provide closure for the families, of course. As Bishop James himself wrote, there can be no closure to love, nor should there be for someone you have loved and lost. Grief is indeed a journey without a destination, but today is a milestone on that journey. It is a moment, I hope, when families will feel able to pause and take quiet pride in the enormity of what they have achieved, not for themselves, but for others, for the British people. But I hope they will serve to cement and strengthen the Hillsborough family's legacy, the changes they have made to benefit an entire nation, and to help ensure that never again can our people be so betrayed by the very organisations and institutions that are meant to protect them. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Minister Shabana Mahmood.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is customary to thank the Government for advance sight of the statement, but I do have to say that given the gravity of this matter, the fact that the report that is being responded to has been with the Government for many years, and in fact the length of the Secretary of State's statement this morning, the fact that I am disappointed to have received the copy of a statement much later than is customary. Madam Deputy Speaker, to describe the events of 15th of April 1989 as far-reaching is wholly inadequate. To say they were tragic misses the point. The name Hillsborough stands to this day as an indictment of institutions, individuals, and an entire culture in which transparency, accountability, and even simple human compassion were absent. I was a child in 1989 when 95 people died at Hillsborough Stadium in the worst sporting disaster in this nation's history. 10 years later, alongside thousands of other law students, I learnt about the shockwaves that the events of that day were still sending through our courts to the continuing pain of the families. This included the death in 1993 of the 96th victim, 22-year-old Anthony Bland, who spent 4 years in a persistent vegetative state before a court made legal history by agreeing that it was in his best interest to withdraw his feeding tube. And let us not forget that it was just 2 years ago that the disaster claimed its 97th victim, 55-year-old Andrew Devine, who had lived with a serious brain injury for more than 3 decades. It has now been 34 years. To say that justice delayed is justice denied would be a significant understatement in this context. It is simply unendurable for any family to be made to wait this long for justice. I want to echo the words of the Secretary of State by paying tribute to Bishop James Jones, the many campaigners both inside and outside of this House who have worked for so long to establish the truth, and above all, to the bereaved families. They have gone beyond what anyone should have to endure to secure justice not only for their own loved ones, but for the victims of future disasters too. They are an inspiration to us all, and I think I speak for the whole House when I say that all of us here know what a debt we owe all of them. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to turn to the detail of the Secretary of State's remarks today. The purpose of the government's response must be centred on the experience of the families, just as Bishop James's report itself was, to ensure that their suffering is remembered and, crucially, never to be repeated. And that is the commitment that the opposition too will make, that we will work to ensure the government's proposals deliver meaningful justice. We welcome the commitment to consult on expanding legal aid for families bereaved through public disaster, but I must say that there is nothing in what we have seen from the government to date to suggest that they will go as far as we believe is needed on requiring public authorities to act with candour and transparency. To the public, a duty on all public bodies to be forthcoming with the truth is a basic requirement if justice is to be done in the wake of terrible events that scar communities and change lives forever. Many will be shocked to hear that this does not already exist as a matter of law. The Hillsborough Law Now campaign, which as the government knows, includes bereaved families who are still fighting for accountability 34 years later, have said to us that without an effective duty of candour in place, the risk is that reform will simply add another layer of bureaucracy to what victims already have to endure. It is for this very reason that over a year ago, the Leader of the Opposition committed to a Hillsborough law, which would first and foremost impose a legal duty on public institutions, public servants and officials to act in the public interest and with transparency, candour and frankness when there has been a major incident. The Secretary of State knows that we have sought to amend his recent legislation to introduce this more effective duty of candour during its passage through Parliament, but that is an approach that the government has thus far rejected. Madam Deputy Speaker, we will continue our efforts in this regard because the government's requirement for a code of ethics is not enough. We do also welcome the commitment to a standing independent public advocate and have supported this change to the Victims and Prisoners Bill. But as the Secretary of State knows, we do also believe and have said to him repeatedly that the duty of candour is the vital missing piece to make effective the changes being made in respect of the independent public advocate. Madam Deputy Speaker, this issue is above party politics, but we do have a duty to say to the government that what they have announced does not yet go far enough. It must deliver on that vital promise that what happened in 1989 and has continued to happen to the families for 34 years will never happen again.
Lord Chancellor.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the Right Honourable Lady for her response. Can I seek to address them in turn? So on the issue of legal aid, we absolutely accept that in this particular case there was manifest and completely unacceptable lack of equality of arms because it was being treated as an adversarial process in a way that is completely inimical to what the inquiry should have been designed to get to the bottom of. The culture was wrong in terms of how lawyers were approaching it. The equality of arms was non-existent. So we have sought to address that in two ways. First, in terms of ensuring that in appropriate cases where frankly it does become adversarial because people are defensive, because they have probably got something wrong, that it is necessary in those cases for the families to have the arms, if you like, the legal arms in order to take that on. That's why, if this had happened today, that funding would have been in place. And by the way, this isn't small amounts of funding. The total amount spent, quite properly, no complaints about this, in the second inquest was around £65 million. So this is a very significant change that has been made already. As I say, we are consulting on whether we should go further still. The issue about candour is, of course, critically important. Running like a message through a stick of rock through Bishop James Jones's report is the importance of changing the culture. So we across this House, and she rightly points out this is not, as it were, a party political issue, must be doing everything we possibly can to change that culture. And what I think is very important about the IPA is if one goes back to the point of learning one about the Charter itself, what Bishop James said was this. He said, I welcome the government's commitment to create an independent public advocate to act for bereaved families after the public disaster. And then he went on to say this. Once a public advocate has been appointed, I offer the Charter to them as a benchmark against which they may assess the way in which public bodies treat those bereaved by tragedy. And then he goes on to talk about the text of the Charter. So we hope that it will play a very, very important part in embedding that culture and holding people to account. But this job is not over. We continue to have the discussion, and I look forward to engaging with the Honourable Lady about it.
Theresa May. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Lord Chancellor for his statement and welcome the government's response, although, like him, I bemoan the fact that it has taken so long to respond to a report which not only did I commission when I was in office, but actually which reported when I was still in office. What underlay the approach, what underpinned the approach of the organs of the state at Hillsborough was a desire to protect themselves and their reputation, rather than serve the public they were there to protect, or indeed search for truth and justice, an attitude which occurred not just on that day, but has continued from those public authorities through the decades since. Can I therefore ask my right honourable friend if he agrees with me that in the Charter, almost the most important point is that it requires organisations to place the public interest above their own reputation? And what specific steps will government be taking to ensure that that culture is instilled across the whole of the public sector?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As always, my right honourable friend absolutely gets to the heart of it. That is the critical and most important point. It's number 2 in the Charter to place the public interest above our own reputation. And she asks, well, those are words, how are those being woven into the culture? One powerful example is today, we are announcing, it's not we, forgive me, the code of practice for ethical policing is being published. That contains, at page 7, under the chapter headed Ensuring Openness and Candour, paragraph 4.5, chief officers have a duty to ensure openness and candour within their force, which will include the following: implementing the Charter for families bereaved through public tragedy, Hillsborough Stadium disaster, lessons that must be learned. So it will be there at the point of training for officers and induction for civil servants. It is going to become part of the warp and weft of this country, part of the culture of what it means to be a civil servant in Britain.
Chris Stevens.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. As someone with great affection for the people of Liverpool and Merseyside, our thoughts are once again with the Hillsborough families today. And can I join the Shadow Front Bench in our qualified thanks in advance sight of this statement? I was pleased that the Lord Chancellor had thanked and congratulated honourable members of this House and Andy Burnham, Andy Burnham and Steve Rotherham for their work in this area. So I have 3 questions for the Lord Chancellor. The Chief Executive of the College of Policing describes Hillsborough as a touchstone for change, but in the years since we've sadly seen a familiar culture of cover-up in relation to tragedies such as Grenfell and the infected blood scandal. So he does appear then to accept the principle, and just so he can clarify, he accepts the principle at some point the public will tire of hearing about promised cultural change without visible action accompanying it. The second question is, no police officer has been disciplined or convicted of any offence relating to the Hillsborough disaster. So does he agree that in cases where it's proven that false evidence was given or inaccurate statements were made, that retrospective action up to and including prosecution must take place? Hear, hear. And finally, part of the reason that the police were able to avoid full scrutiny around Hillsborough for so long was irresponsible reporting of the disaster by sections of the media. Is he convinced that reforms in that area have gone far enough, or does he agree with many of us that more reform in that area is sadly needed?
Hear, hear, hear.
Can I thank the honourable gentleman for those very helpful and pertinent questions? Can I turn first of all to the issue of the police? Because yes, it is one thing setting the culture, which I think it's reasonable to point out is now going to be woven into police training, but accountability matters too. And so one of the things that matters is the police conduct regulations of 2020, which of course post-date this report, include the following in Schedule 2. Police officers must be honest, act with integrity and not compromise or abuse their position, but also this. Police officers have a responsibility to give appropriate cooperation during investigations, inquiries and formal proceedings, participating openly and professionally in line with the expectations of a police officer when identified as a witness. Those are now on the face of the regulations. Breach of those provide a very powerful case, he may think, for dismissal or other suitable sanction. To the point he makes about retrospectivity, plainly, if evidence comes to light about facts, about behaviour at the time, then that can be considered in the normal way. I hope you will be encouraged to know that the offence of misconduct in a public office is being considered by the Law Commission with their usual and typical diligence, and we will be responding in the new year, because I think it's reasonable to observe that it has not operated as we might have liked. It is susceptible to reform, it seems to us, and we are giving that very active attention. To the point he makes about the media and irresponsible coverage, my goodness, he's got a point about that. I think there still needs to be a live conversation, frankly, about whether things have gone far enough.
Sir Robert Neal.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The delay in this report has been unacceptable, but it's absolutely no fault of my right honourable and learned friend, the Lord Chancellor. And can I thank him for his statement, for the tone of his statement, which was characteristically generous-spirited and also full, and for the work he's done to expedite this report. Can I put these points to him? Would he agree with me that going forward it is important to pick up on some of the learning from the two Justice Committee reports, one on the coronial system and one on the pre-legislative scrutiny on the Victims Bill? Will he agree that to achieve the proper outcome as a legacy for the victims of Hillsborough, we should work to the position where it will be the norm that there will be proper legal representation for victims and bereaved families at inquests? That should be the norm rather than any form of exception. Secondly, that the duty of candour should extend in terms of legal representation by government departments to the fullest and earliest possible disclosure of all relevant materials that are in the hands of government departments and their lawyers. And thirdly, that we should work with the excellent current Chief Coroner, and his predecessor, of course, gave powerful evidence to our committee, to ensure that we can ensure greater consistency of standards and approach within the coronial system, which has not always been the case in the past. Would you agree that those are important matters, together with that assurance of equality of arms across the piece?
Very helpful point. So first of all, I would like to pay tribute to the work of the Justice Select Committee and the work that took place in respect of Coroner's Inquest. And indeed, in preparation for this statement, I went back and reread some of the evidence that was given by the then Chief Coroner, Mark Lucraft, when he was talking about this very important issue of equality of arms. Now, he made the point, from his position of Chief Coroner no less, that yes, there are cases, of course, where it's important to have legal representation, and we've made enormous strides, as indicated. Equally, there will be those where sometimes it doesn't actually help terribly, and that's why we have to proceed with care on this. But the key issue is equality of arms, as he rightly points out. This business about candour as regards early disclosure is critical. And one of the important points that can sometimes be lost is, lest we forget, under Section 35 of the Inquiries Act, it is possible for someone to be held criminally liable on pain of a custodial sentence if they fail to act with candour in terms of producing information to an inquiry. That is an important sanction, it seems to me, and in appropriate circumstances, I hope the judges won't hesitate to use it.
Maria Eagle.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Bishop James called his report the patronising disposition of unaccountable power. The key word is unaccountable. 34 years after 97 men, women and children were unlawfully killed in an event that was televised at the time, and that within 4 months the public inquiry into report had pinned the blame on the police. All that time later, no one has been held accountable for what happened at Hillsborough. Now nobody will be. So accountability here is key. And whilst culture change is good, we need legal change too. So therefore, I must say, it's inexplicable to me that there's a failure to legislate here for a full duty of candour for all public officials, to legislate to put the Charter for families bereaved by public tragedy into statute. And the Lord Chancellor knows that I still think that the independent public advocate's powers need to be beefed up to include an ability for him to compel transparency, be a data controller, so to torpedo attempts to cover up, which is what went wrong at Hillsborough. It was the cover-up as much as anything. So will he reconsider his apparent unwillingness to legislate, to make it clear that this House and our nation requires accountability, requires candour, requires public authorities and those who work for them to act in the best interests of those bereaved in these appalling public tragedies that have occurred and will continue to occur?
Can I thank the Honourable Lady, and can I say, I hope entirely fairly that the merits that are in this response, and I think it can reasonably be observed that there are a great number, are in considerable part due to the efforts that she has made engaging with me to make changes and improvements. On the issue of the IPA, for example, there is no doubt, and of course others have fed in as well, not least my right honourable friend, the former Prime Minister, that the IPA will be permanent. That wasn't the original proposal. It will be able to make reports of its own motion to come before this House, not just at the instigation of the state, and also will be able to make recommendations about what sort of inquiry should take place afterwards. It could be, as she knows, some sort of independent panel along the lines of the ones that were set up by Alan Johnson when he was Home Secretary, or indeed a statutory inquiry or non-statutory inquiry. So this IPA is of a different order of muscularity, if I can use that expression, than was originally envisaged, and she plays an important part in that. On the issue of the Hillsborough law, she and I have discussed this. There are countervailing considerations, as she knows, but of course the point is my door remains open, the conversation remains live. We will have a debate upon this, I hope, in the new year, and I look forward to discussing these matters further.
Jackie Doyle-Price.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My right honourable friend's statement goes some way to tackling the institutional behaviour which puts reputational damage and public confidence ahead of the interests of the people they are meant to serve. But the comments he's made are very much in the context of major public incidents. Yes. And I just wondered whether I could ask him how far he thinks that these expectations enshrined in the Charter can be applied to individual cases. And I speak particularly with reference to suicide, where quite often bereaved families attend inquests where the players are quite keen to avoid any suggestion of liability, but that can conflict with what he's described in terms of a duty of candour.
I am so grateful to my honourable friend for raising this critical point. It's not just about major disasters, important though they are. For the victims and the families where something dreadful has happened, they don't want to find themselves in a situation where it's unnecessarily adversarial, or indeed people are frankly just trying to save their own skin, showing institutional defensiveness. So a lot of this frankly comes down to this issue of culture. We are aware of that. So two things to say. First, in terms of the equality of arms, if it is a so-called ECF case, an exceptional case funding test, which is to do with Article 2, there are certain thresholds for that, then legal representation. But also this, on the issue of culture, we have provided this new document here, which includes principles guiding the government's approach when it holds interested person status at an inquest, which is about approaching the inquest with openness and honesty, including supporting the disclosure of all relevant and disclosable information to the coroner. In other words, the state shouldn't be in the position of being defensive, whether it's a major disaster or indeed it's relating to an individual. I hope that assists.
Ian Byrne.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank the Lord Chancellor for this statement today and the empathy and decency shown on the subject of Hillsborough, and also thank him for the words what he said about football supporters not being to blame for Hillsborough. That means a lot to a lot of people.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, that's where my thank yous end. I, like many others, will feel let down today and feel as though this is a world away from the effective legislation we desperately need. I'm really, really worried that it will not prevent another Hillsborough-style state cover-up. Bishop James Jones called for the duty of candour on police officers, but the government's criminal justice bill mentions duty of candour at clause 73 only in the context of a code of conduct, and we talked about this morning. I feel though it's an insult to those affected by state cover-ups in the Memorandum in 97. It does not establish the duty or define a duty in law. It provides no mechanism for compliance and also, crucially, the government will not today introduce a statute duty of candour on all public officials, which is demanded by a Hillsborough law, now campaigners and thankfully supported by my own party. Secretary of the State, without a legal duty of candour on all public servants hardwired into our justice system, we will see continued injustices from public officials who lie on the stand, act with impunity with no consequences. I had hoped today you would push back against the powerful vested interests who do not want to see this accountability in law, but sadly I feel as though they've won once again. Will the Secretary of State reflect on the comments from across this House today and work with us to ensure we get a true Hillsborough law that the 97 and everyone else who has suffered injustice at the hand of the state fully deserve?
Can I thank him for his words at the beginning? I've listened very carefully to what he said subsequently. He asked me if I will reflect. Of course I will reflect. I will listen very carefully to what's been said. We're here to respond, of course, to Bishop James's report, which wasn't principally about the points that have moved on since, which I know we all recognise. We want to change the culture. We remain committed to changing the culture, and I will continue to have that conversation about how we achieve that most effectively.
Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I must say I was just reflecting during the statement that the last time we were here in the Chamber talking about this, we were advised, I think it would be in the course of spring that the response would be produced. So it is welcome to have it here today, and also the general tone and nature of it. It wasn't just a lack of interest in finding the truth that was the issue here. It was the fact that actually organs of the state set out to smear people, to lie and to cover up and to save their own skin. And we can say this was 30 years ago, but we saw worrying a trend of that when we saw at the Stade de France, whilst not in our jurisdiction, an attempt to blame fans for a complete overreaction from the French law enforcement authorities to some incidents there. But what I found interesting is when he talked about the spend on legal representation, which we often saw a completely disproportionate spend. He says it would be proportionate. Who will determine that? Because let's remember, it was some of those bodies who thought it was perfectly proportionate for them to waste millions of pounds trying to save their own skins rather than to find justice.
So this is an excellent point. He asked who will determine it. The whole point about encouraging government departments to publish it is so that the public can make an assessment of whether it's proportionate or not. Frankly, that's an ordinary English word. People should know what it means, and if they don't, that will become clear.
George Howard.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I too thank the Lord Chancellor for the statement today, which, as he conceded, is long overdue. I'd like to also pay tribute to my honourable friend, the member for Garston and Halewood, for the painstaking work she did to expose the evidence that existed but had never been taken into account. I'd also pay tribute to the Right Honourable lady, the member for Maidenhead, who recognised that there was an injustice that had to be put right and set up the process by which Bishop James was able to bring all of those lies and cover-ups to light. Madam Deputy Speaker, following the Hillsborough disaster, together with two constituents, Mr and Mrs Joines, who'd lost a son at Hillsborough, I attended part of the first inquest, and I was shocked by the extent to which that inquest was such a travesty, which seemed to be aimed at blaming the fans rather than the authorities for what happened. And one thing that came out of that for me, and I've said this before, is that there was a massive effort to stereotype football fans as being responsible for something they were actually victims of. And I do believe, and I welcome the fact that a public advocate is going to happen, but I do think, to be absolutely certain, that we need to put that role on the statute book.
To the honourable gentleman, and I thank him for the support that he's given to his constituents, I can confirm that the IPA is being put on the statute book.
Mary Robinson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, the Lord Chancellor, for bringing this statement forward today. Hillsborough is synonymous with cover-up. Innocent victims were blamed for the failures of the police and the emergency services, and whistleblowers were pivotal in bringing a lot of the evidence forward. It's important that we have a duty of candour within the police service. I would say that right across public services, candour should be the golden thread that links them together. With the importance of whistleblowers being so important in this issue and in others, would my right honourable friend also look at the importance of perhaps having an office for the whistleblower, so people who know where to go if they want to raise an issue, and that we don't simply rely on the duty of conduct, that people within organisations can also go somewhere to get help.
I thank my honourable friend for that typically thoughtful and helpful intervention. I think she makes an excellent point. Already within the Civil Service Code, there ought to be arrangements for people to do precisely that. But if we need to go further, let's discuss it. I'll be happy to have that conversation with her. Thank you.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I wonder if I could explore with the Lord Chancellor what he said about Bishop James' recommendation about the pressing need for proper participation of bereaved families at inquests. The Joint Committee on Human Rights held an evidence session on a proposed Hillsborough law and strengthening human rights earlier this summer. We were particularly interested in the impact of the inequality of funding for legal representatives between the state and bereaved families at inquests and inquiries. And in evidence, witnesses argued strongly that there should be a proportionate equality of arms, distinguishing that from a mere parity of arms. And they saw the wider use of exceptional case funding for Article 2 cases as one way of achieving that. Does he agree with that evidence?
She makes an excellent point. So, of course, we think there should be equality of arms. The only point, sort of potential hesitation, is, as I say, I was reading the evidence of the Chief Coroner. What he said is that there are some cases where, although the state is represented and the state is an interested party, it's not necessarily the case where adding lawyers necessarily assists. As he put it, paragraph 97 of his written evidence, there are also arguments which could be advanced that simply adding more lawyers into the system would not necessarily uniformly help bereaved families in all cases. So in our view, it depends, it's on a case-by-case basis. There will be some cases, this is one, where it's manifestly necessary. There are others where there has to be a judicious approach.
James Sunderland.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm privileged to be able to watch regular football in Bracknell, Reading and Aldershot. Following his statement today, is the Lord Chancellor content that sufficient legal and institutional protections are in place to help prevent another event like Hillsborough?
Well, I think, thank you for his question. I think most recognise that there have been very significant changes that have taken place, and I hope we can feel confident that something like this couldn't happen. But in the dreadful event that it were to, we just need to be sure that the resources are in place, the support is in place for families, so they don't have to suffer as they did those years ago.
Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Madam Deputy. And I thank the Minister for the manner in which he opened his statement. But it's really not good enough that it has taken so long to get to this point. And in this House, I want to put on record my deep disappointment that we have waited this long for today. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think in getting the change that has been described, what is being proposed is also not good enough, because, as the Minister said in his statement, in the legal process, in order to achieve what we want, which, as the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead pointed out so correctly, is for public bodies to place the public interest, i.e. the citizens of our country, above the reputations of their own organisations. As he said, it's not just that who is represented, it's how lawyers engage in the inquest process. and indeed with the bereaved families. And it's about establishing not just an inquest, not just in inquiries, but day in, day out, this culture of candour that he talks about. It's about establishing that. Now, I'm not a lawyer, and he is, but I think that lawyers respond to the law. And that is at the heart of why we are so disappointed today not to have a Hillsborough law. I don't want a debate in January. I want a law. So can I ask him if he will meet with myself and other members of this House to discuss how we move forward from this point?
Well, my door is always open, and of course I will speak to the honourable lady and others on the issue of law. It is important also to recognise that part of the statutory framework has moved on. So, in respect of police, for example, I talked about the police conduct regulations of 2020. I recognise, as indeed Bishop James Jones did, that the key thing we want to do is to change the culture. But the law plays a part in that. There have been changes. Let's have some discussions in due course.
Derek Twigg.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I don't think we can repeat often enough, because sometimes I don't think it's understood, just what a web of deceit and lies was put forward by parts of the state, and particularly the police and others, over the years, and the complete effect it had on families who lost loved ones, and I was there on the day, in terrible, terrible circumstances. I don't think we forget how bad that's been. And even up to the second inquest, and I sat through a number of days of that second inquest, when lies were still being told during the inquest, when then video evidence was produced by the family's lawyers to saying, well, there you are, you didn't do what you said. I mean, I was absolutely astounded that these people, all the years afterwards, would stick to these lies. So I come back to the point that I want to make, and I made earlier to the Justice Secretary, is that I really think that we can have a culture change, but what happened at that inquest and all the way up to it shows it is such an in-depth problem that it needs something stronger. And that's why, in terms of the duty of candour, it needs to have a legal basis, legislation for it. And I understand, Madam Deputy Speaker, there are some issues around whether it be national security or lawyers' confidentiality, but they could be got round. So he has given some indication he'll listen, so will he listen and change it to make sure there's actually a legal statutory duty?
Can I thank the Honourable Gentleman who speaks with particular authority on these points. He talks about the second inquest, where people, as you say, were continuing to try to demonstrate the kind of institutional defensiveness. The thing that made a difference there, he may feel, was the fact that there were lawyers there to hold people to account in that kind of case. That's the equality of arms point. And it is important to recognise, I respectfully suggest that now we're in a situation where in this kind of case there will be lawyers to try to expose precisely that kind of defensiveness. So that is extremely important. I respect deeply the points that he makes. Of course we will have a conversation. He knows that there are countervailing issues which he adverts to briefly there. Of course I will have a discussion with him in due course.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are members of this House who were not born when Hillsborough happened, and those of us who were have had lives, careers, families. For the families of the victims to have waited that length of time for justice is intolerable, and then to have it compounded by not having the one thing which ensures you feel justice, that it cannot happen again. So does the Lord Chancellor agree with me that perhaps the only way those families will ever feel they've got justice is if we have a Hillsborough law to prevent it happening again?
The critical thing, of course, is we have to change the culture and ensure that people are held to account for their culture. There are important changes in these measures, as I hope the House will agree. As I said, I've indicated that I'm prepared to discuss with others what further steps are required.
Stephanie Peacock.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's taken 6 years